Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening and welcoming creative nonfiction writer and professor Catina Bacote to Washington State University. I'm Chelsea Ratzliff, an instructor in the English department at WSU Vancouver and co-organizer of the Creative Writers Series. The link to view live captioning is available in the chat. I'd like to begin by thanking our many wonderful partners in this event, the WSU Pullman English Department and College of Arts and Sciences, the WSU Vancouver Library, the Office of Equity and Diversity, Office of Academic Affairs, Office of Student Equity and Outreach, the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as WSU Tri-Cities Writing Center, WSU Common Reading Program, ASWSU, and Landescapes, the Student Literary and Arts Journal. I also want to thank our tech team, Rob Baker and Brian Varner, for making this event possible, as well as the directors and organizers in this series, Pavithra Narayanan, DJ Lee, Cameron McGill, and Peter Chilson. And thank you all in the audience for making the time to be with us. As we remain far-flung in these viral times, we would love to see you put in the chat where you're all from. I come to you from the homelands of the Chinookan and Tadnapam peoples and the Cowlitz Indian tribe. Actually, all of WSU's campuses statewide are on the homelands of Indigenous peoples. We honor their continued presence here and recognize that our ongoing commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion is ultimately reflected in our relationship to our Indigenous community members, socially, financially, and environmentally. Bacote's reading this evening has clear and critical connections to our common reading book this year, Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, which details Noah's account of growing up in apartheid South Africa. Similarly, Bacote's writing is a testament to what she calls the other America, where Black neighborhoods are entrenched in the violent legacies of policing and poverty, where words like justice and community policing too often mean only more of the same. Bacote's work reminds us that there are more questions we should be asking about violence and policing and its intergenerational impact, and also about our own humanity and how we regard the humanity of one another. During her talk, please use the YouTube chat to engage and respond throughout the talk, and we'll also have a Q&A where you can ask all of your burning questions. I will now give the virtual floor to Dr. Obi Ford III to introduce Catina Bacote.
Thank you so much. I have the distinct joy and honor of introducing Catina Bacote. Catina Bacote is a writer and teacher. She grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, and lives in New York City. Her nonfiction has appeared in Tin House, Plowshares, Gettysburg Review, Gulf Coast, Tri-Quarterly, Prairie Schooner, Quayle, December Magazine, Southern California Review, The Common, and the anthology, This Is the Place, Women Writing About Home. Catina Bacote is a 2021-2022 Jerome Hill Artist Fellow. She was also writer in residence at the MacDowell Colony, where she received the Ann Cox Chambers Long-Form Journalism Fellowship, the Ragdale Foundation, where she received the Alice Judson Hayes Social Justice Fellowship, and a resident of the Jurassic Resident Artist Program, just to name a few. Catina Bacote teaches creative writing at St. John's University and online workshops at the Flatiron Writers Room. Her research and writing consider the lasting impact of racism, segregation, and economic oppression on families and communities. She has a deep love for teaching, and her work is critically important, exquisite to read, thought-provoking, and encourages crucial conversation. What a treat that she is with us this evening. And so without further ado, please give a warm welcome to prolific writer, outstanding teacher, and my dear friend, Catina Bacote.
Thank you so much, Obi, for that introduction. You introduced me to the WSU community, and I wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for you, so thank you. Thank you, Chelsea, for opening this event. I'm joining you all from Queens, New York. I am on the land of the Lenape people. And I'd like to start off with a moment of silence for all the various types of violence in our world, the types of displacement, for the global pandemic that has taken millions of lives and caused millions of more to suffer. I'm grateful to be here with you this evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being in the room. I also like to thank the WSU Vancouver English Department for the invitation, and I'd like to thank the department and the sponsors for hosting me. I'm going to read you 3 pieces this evening, and then we will open the floor. And as much as we can, it would be great if we could have a conversation. So of course, ask me questions and I will respond, but also put your thoughts, what you're thinking about your own writing, what you're thinking about what I've read, what you're thinking about questions that other people are asking. And we'll do our best to try to have a conversation this evening. So as Obi said, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, and I grew up in a housing project called Eastern Circle. And I thought it was one of the best places to grow up as a kid. It was a place where I knew everyone who lived there, where I knew people looked out for each other, and where I felt safe. And that changed when I became a teenager. And Eastern Circle became a troubled place. And all throughout my teenage years and for many years of my adult life, I didn't understand the root causes of those changes, what brought those changes on. I didn't understand what those changes had done to me or my family or my neighbors, but I had a lot of questions. And it was my questions that led me to the book that I'm writing now. And the working title of that book is Eastern Circle. And it's about the lasting impact of the illegal drug trade on my family and community. And as much as the book is about the 1980s drug epidemic, it's also about a close-knit family and their love. It's about the resiliency of a community. My grandparents moved into Eastern Circle the first year that it opened in 1960. And my last relative was born there in 2001. So there have been 4 generations of my family who have lived in Eastern Circle. And one of the reasons it's important to our story, I think there are many, but one of them is because it represents the physical, social, and economic isolation we experienced. I'd like to read you an excerpt from the beginning of the book that I'm working on. And this excerpt you can find it online if you want to go back to it. At Tin House, a version of it was published on Tin House. And a version was published in the anthology, This Is the Place, Women Writing About Home. And I'll just say at the beginning here, because I know it trips some people up, I call my grandfather Dada. When I go back to my old neighborhood, whole apartment buildings are gone. Brush completely covers the brook. There aren't any basketball court, clothesline, or cellar doors. The wooden logs that mark the bus stop have been taken up too. Even the sign, green with white letters, Eastern Circle, has been done away with. I watch a few kids run around in the cool evening air under a darkening sky. My childhood here may not have been so different from theirs. But then again, maybe it was, because even though the layout is the same, apartment buildings strung along a sloping hill, front and back porches, small oaks planted along the curb, and a handful of parking lots, the spirit of the place has changed. The projects lie on the easternmost edge of the city. And when I was growing up, it seemed as far away from the mall, McDonald's, Burger King, and the Coliseum as any neighborhood could get while still being in New Haven. It felt like we were more in the country than in the city. And it wasn't just the shallow brook that we jumped across or the rust-colored cliffs that broke the skyline. It had to do with the way we just about lived outside in the summer and how we recognized someone from far away by the cut of his face or the curve of her back, as a Sims or a Diamond or a Rex. It seemed like only a dozen or so families lived in the neighborhood because so many of us had relatives there. Whole clans with long-standing ties to the project stretched from the top of the hill all the way to its bottom. We carried ourselves like villagers, charming, quiet, territorial. And even though our well-being didn't hinge on the rotation of crops or a robust rainy season, our rhythms were still in tune with the seasons. Regardless of what the calendar announced, we marked summer from the first warm day of spring to the last balmy day of fall. Winter was no more than a holding pattern, a time to cool down and rest, because as soon as the days got longer, Eastern Circle opened up. Picture the first hint of clear skies and rising temperatures. Shorts yanked from the bottom of drawers, feet slipped into dusty sandals, apartment doors thrown wide, and hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of kids waking up from a short slumber, a hypnotic haze, and fanning out across the projects. We didn't just settle for jump rope or Mother May I. We put our hands on everything the neighborhood offered. Stacking mud pies along the side of buildings, catching caterpillars in mason jars, and spreading eagle on the ground, one eye open and the other closed, aiming our marble for the makeshift hole. The ground below our feet and the sky hovering above our heads belonged to us, and nothing in our sight was off limits except the woods behind the projects. Our home had been carved from that thicket of trees and bushes, and in that shadowy world hid raccoons, skunks, possum, and worst of all, snakes. Staying away from that wild stretch of land kept us safe into the day my friend and I skidded back and forth in my grandparents' yard, kicking up dirt. Around the time when I called gotcha and she whined no fear, a pack of dogs rushed out of the woods and straight for us. A sudden hailstorm of muscled jaws, dark gums, and teeth. I ran one way and my friend ran another, and the dogs chased her. She stumbled up a rocky hill on the side of the yard before the dogs pinned her against a wall. They stood on their hind legs and growled in her face. She cried. They moved in closer. Her ponytail bobbed in and out of my sight. I jumped up and down and hollered. My grandfather rushed out of his house with a huge wooden stick and charged right into the pack. His voice boomed, the span at his back widened, dust rose up around him, and just as quickly as they had come, the dogs retreated. Living in Eastern Circle and being under Dada's watchful eye were one and the same. Stories about him floated through the projects. Mr. Allen arrived a moment before the bully threw his first punch. He found a finger that had been severed and flung into the grass. He caught a pregnant woman flying down a flight of stairs. And even if you hadn't heard any of the stories, you knew his garden. His 20 rows of fruits and vegetables stood out from everything around it. The project's big brick apartment buildings were identical. 2 stories with 6 apartments, all with the same porches, doors, windows, and small black mailboxes. Every building had a nearby parking lot with a dumpster. The walkways, grassy fields, and clothesline were the same at the top of the hill as they were at its bottom. Dada's garden broke up the monotony. Its shades of blue-green and burnt orange deepened with the day's changing light. From week to week, buds spread and leaves unfurled. Even the dirt, raked and moist, yielded variation. Smooth stones broken into bits, tiny sand crystals, dark clay. I lived up the hill from my grandfather with my mother and younger brother. Whenever I walked to my grandparents' house, the garden slowly came into view. Tomato plants wrapped around branches, yellow squash tucked between leaves, eggplants suspended from vines like dark half moons. The last time I visited him, his work from the morning had left its mark. The loosened soil and watered rose bush gave the yard a sweet, earthy smell. We sat on the porch and dealt with matters big and small, like my high school grades and what he thought of my new boyfriend. Dada didn't go on and on about what needed to be done or spin corny homilies like do your best or be careful. It wasn't his style. Plus, he liked to hear me talk. He thought all my words lined up just right, even my beginner Spanish. So with great exaggeration, I shook my mouth loose and told him to repeat after me. azul, marron, dorado, violeta. Raising only one of his eyebrows and clearing his throat, he asked me if I was ready for him to take his turn. I pretended to think about it before I nodded. He didn't speak Spanish, but he liked to put on a show. So he gave a lot of weight to each word and rolled his R's way too long. I leaned into his shoulder and laughed. I've come back to my old neighborhood because my memories of my grandfather rest here. It's over 20 years since I've lived in the projects, and I've never felt a place with so much like home. Sometimes I conjure up Eastern Circle as more mythical than real, and I let my memories have their way because there's an understanding to be gained in the mythical too, a way to get at a truth that can't be reached any other way. When I talk with people I grew up with about their childhood years, they say it had been the best place they ever lived, like one big family. There's stock lines that hold something true. At one time, Eastern Circle was a tight-knit neighborhood, 21 apartment buildings and 142 Black families, all held together by the Circle, a ring-shaped street in the center of the projects. As I come closer to the building where my grandparents used to live, a strange sensation comes over me. It's not a feeling of dread or anxiety, but something else. I'm trying to understand exactly what's happening as the past comes into view. Their front door, the porch, the 2 living room windows, the small dirt yard. I expected to feel only one thing when I got to their old apartment: comfort or distress, uncertainty or confusion. But I'm experiencing the pleasures of my childhood and the pain of my teenage years all at once. A few days after sitting with my grandfather on his porch and laughing at his showmanship, I spotted my mother's journal on our stairway. The brown cover had musical notes on it, and for the first time, I picked it up. I wanted to understand my feelings, or at least what to do with it. Flipping through the pages, I found the day, June 11, 1987. My mother had only written, "My father died." At that moment, I made a decision that I'm desperate to undo. I convinced myself that those words were enough. Dada had been murdered. And the only way to survive losing him was through restraint. I didn't talk about him to my friends. I wouldn't put up any photos that had him in them. And I've still never been to visit his grave. All a feeble attempt to move forward. But now I need to go back. And it isn't because I'm a long way from being 14 years old or because time has passed, but because what I believed about his murder all these years isn't true. 5 years after he died, a mural went up in the projects. A group of the guys paid an artist to spray paint it on the side of a building. The way I remember it, the letters RIP were at the top, and underneath it were the names of residents who had been murdered. I thought it was nice of the guys to include my grandfather, since his death wasn't a part of all that had happened. He had been killed right before coke and heroin bowed down to crack, before users became addicts and small guns were put aside for Glocks. And the guys in Eastern Circle hadn't become the Eastview Posse yet. The mural was large enough to be seen from the Circle, the street in the center of the projects, which is where I stood. I could make out Dada's name easily, James Allen Jr. Now I look toward the brick wall that the names have been painted on. The wall is still there, but the names are gone. In 2007, a demolition began in the projects. City officials made all the residents leave. 9 apartment buildings came down, and even part of the street that made up the Circle was broken apart and carted off. What remained was built back up. I wander further up the hill, taking in everything that's been revamped or done away with, and wonder what it takes for an entire neighborhood or just one person to change course. From my vantage point on the hill, I can see all the changes made by the Housing Authority. Their new office is visible, as are the security cameras attached to the side of buildings. The Circle became a cul-de-sac because they figured the old street made it easy for people buying drugs to come in and out. When I was young, the circle felt like a symbol for our lives, but maybe with its allusions to peace and harmony, it promised too much. The name of the street leading into the projects has been changed too. Later, I find out that it was named after Levi Jackson, who grew up in New Haven. He's one of the city's bright spots because in 1946, he enrolled at Yale University and joined its football team as its first Black player. Eastern Circle is now Jackson Lane. Renaming the street establishes a new beginning for New Haven and the projects, and I understand the impulse to sever the past, to uproot it completely. But even so, some things remain. There's still so much sky, and the smell of bluegrass and dandelions is the same. And in the distance, I can see East Rock, an ancient ridge of sandstone that shoots up 300 feet in the air. Its brown ridges can be seen from anywhere in the projects. I've never been to the top, but I know that people go up there to take in a view of the city, the New Haven Harbor feeding into the Long Island Sound, the downtown office towers, the grand arches of Yale, the railroad tracks and lines of trains. From where I'm standing, I can see the monument that rests on East Rock's highest summit, a tribute to soldiers who gave their lives in war. The city, like the nation, stamps the past with one battle or another. Statues are built to remember the fallen, to honor sacrifices, to recognize all the terrible losses. And I think there should be a marker for those who died in Eastern Circle, something more lasting than the mural that was painted on the brick wall. It would make it harder for the deaths to be forgotten or denied or justified or diminished. I'd hold it in my mind as a stark contrast to all the monuments that put forward the idea that American victories and splendor serve everyone to the same degree. I get to the very top of the hill and have no choice but to turn around and head back down. Seeing the building where my grandparents used to live in the distance, I think about when I was 14 years old and held on to my mother's journal. I had no idea what she had written, but before I opened it or turned any pages, I felt certain she must have left some words behind. I couldn't imagine how anyone could put something so big down on paper, how our loss could be faced in its entirety. But even then, I knew it was something that should be done. So I'd like to show you a few pictures of Eastern Circle and my family. And while I do that, I'd like you to think of a picture that represents a story you like to tell about yourself or your family. And this could be a picture that just has stayed in your mind for a long time. This could be a picture that you see often because it's on your phone or it's hanging up on a wall. But I want you to think of a picture that might represent a story you want to tell about you or your family. And I invite you to write something about that picture in the chat. And perhaps we can hear a few of those before I read my next piece. So I'll show you these pictures, and research is really important to my work, and documents are really important to my work. So pictures are an easy way for me to start writing about something, mostly because they're really accessible, right? Especially with family photographs or photographs you had. So this is a photograph of Eastern Circle when it was being built. And I have tons of photographs. I even have the drawings of before, when the architects were thinking about Eastern Circle. And I love seeing this process of, dirt being dug up to buildings start to go up to what Eastern Circle looks like. And it reminds me also that Eastern Circle is a built place, right? Housing projects are intentional places. They're places that are built because of policy. And so those pictures also remind me of that. This is an aerial photograph at night of Eastern Circle. And you can kind of see the circle there, which has taken a more and more meaning to me in terms of thinking about our community. And the picture, I mean, the buildings, as you can see, aren't all uniform. And that was because the architect at the time thought it added interest to the design. And so here's a picture from 1960, the first year of the housing project. This middle picture is my family in Eastern Circle. So those are my two aunts and my uncle, my grandparents' children. And I'm not sure how well you can see the final picture, but there's another picture that is Eastern Circle now. It's not called Eastern Circle, as you just learned. And there are security cameras attached to different apartment buildings. And so that's what that last image shows. Okay. Yes, this is me and my grandfather. That's Dada. We're in Eastern Circle. One of my favorite pictures of us together. And this is my grandmother and grandfather, Mama and Dada, and their two children and their grandchildren. And this is an Eastern Circle. So you probably can see a little bit why I say it felt like we lived in the country more than in the city. And I'm positive this is probably a first day of school picture because we always got dressed up and took pictures on the first day of school. So I hope you're thinking about your own pictures, and I hope a few people write something in the chat about what picture you choose. I might choose this picture right here to write off of. I haven't done that. And this is me when I was 14 years old, 1987, in my track uniform. I ran track. My grandfather came to every track meet I had, he was there. And he would actually run. He was 61 years old at the time. He was 61 years old when he died, and he had had lung surgery. He had had diabetes, but he was a pretty strong person. And he used to run down the straightaway to meet me at the finish line. You know, I did sprints. I did the 100, the 200, the 4x1, the 4x100. So he was pretty fast. He would meet me at that finish line and be there when I got there. And this is my mom and my grandmother. So since I mentioned them in the essay, I wanted to show you who they are. This is me and my mommy. And this is in our apartment in Eastern Circle. And this is a picture of the mural that I told you about. I never knew we had a picture of it. And I had gone through my photo albums, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, and I hadn't seen a picture, but one day I was just going through some paperwork my mom had, and she had this picture here of the mural. And the last picture that I will show you that was my grandfather's last garden. And you can see his rose bush is strung across the windows there. And he had great relationships with everyone in the neighborhood. And he was really close to his next door neighbors. So they let him take over their yard too. So the garden kind of, spanned a lot longer than most people's yard. So I'm going to stop this share. And if there are a few people who'd like to share thoughts about a photograph that comes to mind for you and thinking about your own story or your own family, we'll give space to that.
There's a couple of comments in the chat of people thinking about pictures. Gabriel Davis is thinking about a picture with his grandfather, and he says, "I hate my hair in the photo, but I remember the photo because it was the last I took with him. Him holding me as a mere newborn. It was not long after when he died in the hospital."
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and then he says how strange it is for a grandfather I'd never formally met, and how much he would teach me so much posthumously. And then Kathy shared, she says, "Katina, I also think of a picture with my grandparent, my grandma, the only grandparent I knew, who died when I was 11. It's an awkward studio photo with her and my siblings and our best Sunday gear." And then Elena is sharing, there's a picture of my mother when I was 6 years old, and she had just brought my baby brother home from the hospital. My dad tried to take a picture of her, but she held her up, hiding her face. Looking back, this foreshadows what was soon to come, which was their divorce.
Thank you for folks who shared about their photographs and those stories, those family stories. I learn something new all the time when I go back to photographs, even if I've been looking at them for a long time. And sometimes it's something I actually see, and sometimes it's something I feel, something I sense. So thank you for that. And I do have a few other photos to show you in a little bit. But I didn't know that you had read the class at WSU, the creative writing class, had read Trevor Noah's memoir. And I've read it. And it made me think of this one part in my book. When I am a sophomore in college, an undergraduate, my sociology teacher assigns us a reading. And this reading called Out There appeared in the New Yorker, but it was about New Haven. The reporter had gone to New Haven. He had spent probably close to a year there, and he had been befriended a young man there, and this young man was selling drugs. And so the idea was to get a sense of his life and his family's life and New Haven. And so the article is about the poverty level, right? In New Haven, it's about the joblessness in New Haven. It's about the condition of the housing, the condition of schools. And at one point, this reporter, William Finnegan, says he compares what he sees in New Haven and the housing projects in New Haven, there's many of them, to when he was in apartheid South Africa. Because the desolation reminds him of them. And he actually compares the numbers of how much schools spend on students in apartheid South Africa and we're spending in New Haven. And he paints a pretty dire picture of New Haven. He paints a pretty dire picture, and that was in 1990. So a few years after what I'm talking about. But that just came up for me, that connection to South Africa. And I never forgot that when I read that. And I mean, I had never read anything someone from New Haven had written about New Haven. So that was my first time. And there was so much that felt familiar about what he said and things that I learned. And when I was, I guess, a child growing up, I thought the struggles of my family and my neighbors were based on things like bad timing or poor judgment or unfortunate coincidences. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I started to understand our struggles in a wider context, that I understood how our lives had been marked by exploitation, by segregation, by exclusion. So in my writing, and especially in this book, I'm often trying to blend private history and public history. I know the 1980s, when Eastern Circle began to change, didn't just happen, right? I know there were events that led to it, and I know there's an entire context around the 1980s drug epidemic, the influx of guns into poor Black communities. And so I try to get to that in the book by actually following the journey of my family. So you get my family in the 1950s and 60s and 70s up into the 80s. And then I go beyond the 80s because I think the aftermath of the 80s is also important. And so I'll just say that for now. So I'm going to read you a short excerpt from a chapter in the book that's about my grandparents moving from the southern part of the United States to the northern part of the United States. And it's about their efforts to find the best home for their new family while they're navigating racism and poverty in the city. And a version of this essay was published in December magazine. At 20 years old, my grandmother Louise began her trek toward Eastern Circle. She boarded a Greyhound bus in Nashville, Tennessee, with her sister-in-law behind her and her one-year-old daughter bundled in her arms. She had only a small duffel bag because her husband, Junior, had already taken the suitcase filled with most of their possessions. His work shirts and paints holding the faint smell of oil, her 2 long pleated skirts and 3 button-down blouses, in the best dress she had, moss-colored with a high waist. There were no tablecloths or dollies, empire curtains, or handmade quilts to pack. After 4 years of marriage, they still didn't have a place of their own. And that's exactly why they were leaving. Living with Junior's family had limited all the ways her and her husband could show they cared for each other. She didn't have any pots or pans to grease and scour, and he didn't have any loose floorboards to fix. And all the hours they spent trying to stay out of the way and be quiet had put boundaries around their love. She watched Nashville pass by out the slanted bus window, and her biggest regret was leaving her 3 sisters behind. But she didn't feel like she had a choice. Even though it was 1952, the best things in Music City were still off limits to her. She wasn't even allowed to squeeze herself in between the throng of listeners stacked in the wooden benches at the Grand Ole Opry. Instead, she listened to D4 Bailey's crooning harmonica and Minnie Pearl's scratchy voice on WSM. Sometimes she pressed her face against the radio dials and let the country and blues songs pass right through her. Only 2 things brought the entire family around the neighborhood: big news stories, like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and anything that had to do with their own kind. Broadcasts about people like them were few, swinging wildly between what the station deemed Negro achievements. The Tuskegee Airmen fly to Italy to beat back fascism, and the disgrace of an unruly race. Hundreds in Detroit and Harlem smashed windows and burned down buildings. More frequently, they're heard blasts about actors, singers, and dancers, and of course, the sporting events. When she was 11 years old, Hurricane Henry, who was Black, duked it out in a boxing ring with the Clutch, who was white. Louise's grandparents settled into kitchen chairs set on both sides of the radio, and her mother, Doe, perched herself on the stool. Louise and her sisters plopped down on the floor right in front of the radio, crossed their legs, and looked up as if all the action was playing out in front of them. Grandma Edna, with her spit cup in hand, had the volume turned up just enough to hear the announcer. The Clutch, the lightweight champion, ruled the ring for the first 3 rounds, but soon the fight took a turn. Hurricane Henry relied on his devastating uppercuts and fast feet to make a comeback. After 7 more rounds, his opponent squinted instead of glared, staggered instead of danced. The decision was unanimous. The winner of the fight was Hurricane Henry. The crowd in Madison Square Garden erupted in applause and boos. Louise covered her mouth. She looked around to make sure her younger sisters did the same. With their hands pressed against their lips, they ran out of the house and into the woods out back. Under the moonlight, in the same forest that the family chopped logs and hauled water from the spring, the girls screeched and yelped and jumped up and down. They knew such sounds shouldn't be heard coming from the house, since their white neighbors had been listening to the boxing match too. Louise, taller than her sisters, grabbed their hands and they skipped in a circle. The soft ground met their feet. The dim reflection of yellow pines and scarlet oaks surrounded them. When she let go of her sister's hands, her loose braids and slender arms shot through the night air. She pushed out short, sharp breaths. Her heart raced. 9 years later, with her forehead pressed up against the Greyhound window, the same kind of joy rose up in her. Because to be on that bus headed out of Nashville felt like a victory. So as you probably can tell, my family has been really, really important to me in creating this story that I'm writing in my book. And, excuse me, and I just learned so many things from them. And one of them is that when my mother and my was young, right? And so I'm thinking around the 1960s, her father would come home and sometimes sing for them. He'd sing often at the dinner table to the kids and his wife. And I found out what that song was, and I've listened to it lots of times. So I'd like to play a little bit of it for you. And the other thing I'd like to do is to show you a few pictures The first one being my grandmother. She's the tallest with her sisters. And then I'm not going to say anything about the pictures. There's just a few of them. I'm going to let them roll through as you listen to the music. And now I have a new question for you that if you want to, I invite you to write in the prompt. I'd like you to think about a photograph that does not exist, that has never been taken of you or your family, but that you wish did exist. What would that photograph be? So I'd like you to think of a photograph that does not exist of you or your family, but that you would like for it to exist. What would that photograph be? And I invite you, if you feel comfortable, to write something in the chat, and Chelsea will read what's there when I'm done. Okay, so first the song, to tell you a little bit about the song, it's by the Mills Brothers, and it's called Put Another Chair at the Table.
So put another chair at the table. Put another chair there for me. Put another chair at the table. Set another place there for me. I know that you've been blue and you have missed me too, but now I'm coming home to you, my dear. Put another chair at the table. Put another chair there for me. The time will soon be here when I'll be sitting there, right back where I belong. So put another chair at the table. Put another chair.
So one of the photographs was of my grandmother and grandfather in 1948 in a studio in Nashville, Tennessee. And I had been talking to my grandmother for years about her life, my grandfather's life, and I had never saw this photograph. I don't know where she kept it because it wasn't in her photo albums. But one day she takes it out and she's like, I have something to show you. And she shows me this picture. This is before they're married. So she's 16 years old. He's 22 years old. And it's one of my favorite pictures of them. And I turned it on the back, and I see she wrote, "My future husband." And those three words made me think so much about her optimism and just the hope she had for her family in their life together. And it became an important part of the book. So Chelsea, are there things that you want to share that people have written in the chat?
Yeah, just quickly, some people are asking what the song is so they can look it up.
Okay. So it's Put Another Chair at the Table by the Mills Brothers.
Thank you for that. And there's some people sharing the photo that they wish existed. Jennifer says, I would have loved to have a photo of all of my grandparents together. It has never happened. I had 6 sets of grandparents as a child. Kathy says, one of my family with my mom's parents at their house on Christmas in 2015. That was the last Christmas with my grandpa before he passed a few days later after my 16th birthday. And Gabriel says, easy, the photo of me with my grandfather.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who wrote something in the chat. And you can continue to put those things in. And if I don't hear them, then I can't see the chat, but other people who can see the chat will get to read about your photograph. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to, the last thing I'm going to read right now is a standalone essay. So this essay is not part of the book. And I wrote it in the spring and summer of 2020. It was after George Floyd's murder and after the mass protest for Black lives. "83 questions about the death of Deshaun Wilson, an ongoing investigation. Who called Marilaz C. Elliott and told her that her son had died in police custody? How many minutes did it take for the police to drive Deshaun from where he was arrested in New Haven to the police station at 1 Union Square? Did someone take his fingerprints and mugshot? Did they empty his pockets? When would he have been able to make a phone call? Who would he have called? What happened between 2 a.m. when he was arrested and 2:45 a.m. when he was found unconscious in a detention cell? Who entered his cell and why? At what time did a doctor pronounce him dead? How did Deshaun Wilson die? Did he live in New Haven all his life? Did he ever sit on the grass on the green? Before he went to Hill House High School, did he go to Lincoln Bassett or Conti Middle School or somewhere else? Did he ever run around at East Rock or Edgewood Park? Did he hang out often at 50 Fitch? Was he at the club the one and only night I went there to party? Did he ever watch sports on the big screens at Buffalo Wild Wings? Did he ever wear a new outfit and sneakers to the Freddie Fixer parade? Did he like to dance or remember his dreams? Did his mother call him family-oriented in front of the police station because of how he looked after her or took care of his son or both? Did he tell his mother he loved her the last time he saw her? What will his 6-year-old son, Deshaun Jr., remember about him? Will he be able to hold on to his father the way his father smelled or the sound of his voice? What happened on April 15th, 2020, when Deshaun Wilson was arrested for a domestic dispute? Who at the scene felt threatened? Was there a scuffle, an exchange of hateful words, a hit or a kick or a scream? Was anyone tired? Was anyone calm? Was anyone angry or frightened or frustrated or sad or hostile or broken or careless or cruel? How long did it take Deshaun Wilson to die? Where is his body right now? Where will it be tomorrow? Who were the arresting officers and what are their records? Who else was at the police station? In the 45 minutes that Deshaun was in custody, how many minutes was he alone? What did the medical personnel called to the scene see? Where are the cameras in the station? When New Haven Police Department officers stood outside to show their disapproval of George Floyd's murder, did any of them think about Deshaun, since he was Black and male and his death was still an ongoing investigation? How often did Deshaun and my XXX work the same shift at Sonic? Who was faster on the grill when orders for burgers, chicken, and fries came in one after another? Who saw them when they went out back to smoke together? What did they think about while they waited for their shift to end? Did anyone notice them in the evenings walking to the bus stop side by side? How long did it take for them to get tight? When they talked about their children, what made them laugh? I wonder if both Deshaun and my XXX nodded their heads in the same way when they played rap on their phones, if they kept anything besides letters and cards from their time in prison, if they listened more than they talked for the same reasons. Had they both been stopped by the police while walking down the street in New Haven? Had they both had a police gun pointed in their face? Had they both been taunted by an officer for being afraid? Will any of my questions put my XXX in harm's way? Who is the chief medical examiner whose preliminary finding ruled Deshaun's death a suicide? Did the examiner go beyond a routine autopsy and dissect his neck, back, and face? Was there a close inspection of his spine and scrotum? What evidence of suicide did the examiner find? Is it the same evidence, marks around the neck found in the death of Sandra Bland? What would Deshaun have said if my XXX had told him about his 21-year-old uncle who was found dead in a New Haven jail cell in 1973? What would he have said if he knew the death had been ruled a suicide, that the family hired a lawyer to uncover the truth, and that they lost the case? What was the first step in the internal police investigation into the death of Deshaun Wilson? Who knows besides the police? Has a New Haven Police Department officer ever been found responsible for the death of someone? Do the documents from an internal police investigation ever become public record? What does it mean to trust the police to reveal the truth? When Deshaun Jr. grows up, what will he believe about his father's death? Who noticed Deshaun was always smiling and gave him the nickname Cheese? Why did he wear chains with crosses on them? What did he like most about the comedy skit exposing police racial profiling posted on his Facebook page? What was his favorite song of all time? What did he do last year to celebrate his 30th birthday? Why did Mayor Les C. Elliott and local clergy have to hold a press conference outside the police station 2 weeks after Deshaun's death to demand answers? Why is the Fox 61 video of the press conference shorter than the one that originally aired? Why doesn't the edited video include anything about Deshaun's smile or his son? Why does the newly edited video end with a member of the clergy saying, whether he hung himself or not, or whatever the case may be? What happened when the police and state attorney's office sat down together to review the investigative material? Where will the two lawyers representing the family begin? Who will know that Deshaun Wilson died in police custody? Why doesn't the American government keep a comprehensive and accurate record of those who lose their life while being apprehended, arrested, or detained by the police? When will the Department of Justice begin to enforce the Death in Custody Reporting Act passed by Congress in 2013? How many sons and daughters, mothers and fathers have met their end without a cell phone video or a convenience store camera to capture their death? Who were they? How did they die? Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Catina. And that piece in particular is just really stuck with me, and I know my students from our class on Wednesday. I have a few questions about that piece in particular, if you're ready for them. This first question or group of questions is from Elena, and she wants to know, did you ever get the answers to your 83 questions? Did you expect to? From whom did you seek answers? And what questions remain?
Thank you for that question, Elena. I have not received answers to my questions. And so I made a certain decision when I wrote this essay, because there's all different types of avenues to do research, right? And so sometimes there's essays I've written about people I don't know. And then I make an effort to interview them and get to know them and tell them I'm writing about them. And I've had success with that, reaching out to their family members, their friends, and things of that sort. But Deshaun, he had died pretty recently after, when I started writing this essay. And so I made a decision not to reach out to his family to ask questions. And there wasn't a way. Another thing that I do is I often use the Freedom of Information Act to request files. You can request police reports, prison records, all types of things. But this was an open investigation, so I wasn't going to get any of that material. So I really used just a few sources. I used my family member who knew Deshaun. I used news articles and that video I talked about. And I also used Facebook And at the time, Deshaun's Facebook page was public. And so I just looked at everything on his page. Where's what some of my questions come from about his life. And I just used whatever I could to help inform myself. And so the only thing I've really been doing is checking in with the one person that is that I know who knows Deshaun, and also just looking to see if there are any new news articles. But there haven't been. I've checked this week and there hasn't been anything new. So I hope these questions are answered. I hope many of them are answered through the legal case that happens. And yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it reminds me of the first piece you read and picking up your mother's journal and thinking this isn't sufficient, right? It's not enough to accept kind of the simple version. And so I love the way your questions really get at the complexity of the issue and demand more. Gabriel's question is, how do you keep your writing so clear when there is so much emotion in what you're writing? If I were to try something like 83 questions, I'd be lost in my emotion.
Thank you for that. So I definitely write about things that matter a great deal to me, right? I write from my heart. And it doesn't mean my head, my intellect, and my sense of ethics and all of that, aren't tied with it, but I definitely write from my heart. So I think you're absolutely right to ask that question, right? How to write about things that are so emotionally difficult. And so sometimes I'm writing about things that happened 20, 25 years ago. And so I've had some time to process them and write about it. It doesn't mean it's still not difficult. And sometimes in this case, where you saw with 83 questions, is something that recently happened, and there's a lot of emotions around it. But often I write to find out what I am thinking and feeling. So often it's before I write that my feelings and my thoughts feel more muddled. And through writing, I gain a bit of clarity, at least about what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling, or my intentions for the piece, right? Because I'm always writing from questions, right? I'm always trying to make my work inquiry based, right? What are questions that have stayed with me for 30 years? What are questions that came up for me this month? And then how can I pursue those questions through my writing, right? Because in an essay or a personal memoir, I am making an attempt to understand something. Doesn't mean I'm going to get all the answers, right? As I just said, but it means that it's something I want to understand. It's something that I want to grapple with. And so for me, I just write it all out. I just put everything on the page, including my emotions, right? And there's times I know I have this one piece of writing where I just say, I don't want to write this book. I don't want to write this book that I'm writing. I don't want to write it. And I wrote all the reasons I didn't want to write it. So I feel like there is a space for the writer's emotions in the work, right? I would never say leave that out. And I also understand what you're saying about a certain sense of clarity. And for me, my clarity in my writing comes through revision. I think revision is everything for writing. I would never want to show anyone in this virtual room anything that is a first, second, or third draft. And so I am willing to go back to something and think about that idea of clarity, right? And this essay came to me not so much in front of my computer, because I know writing happens in other places besides our computer. It came to me when I was on the phone with a family member. It came to me when I was in the park walking with a friend during the early days of the pandemic in New York City. And I really started to have these real questions about what happened. And I had reached out to certain organizations in New Haven, trying to see if any of the political activist organizations were asking these questions. And I wasn't getting any answers there. And so I actually just started writing questions on scraps of paper. And eventually I decided to sit down and put them in this essay. And that worked for me. But often, like I said, if you have muddled thoughts, if you have lots of feelings, I say put them all down on paper and then go back to them and see what you can make of them, what you can, in what way you can shape them so that your reader can enter into this world you're creating or enter into these questions that you're asking in a way that feels clear, in a way that the reader feels like the narrator is holding her hand and leading her in some way. And by the way, if I don't answer any of your questions, it wasn't exactly what you were saying, I'm asking, feel free to come back at me again.
Thank you for that. Renee wants to know, she writes, I would love to know how you managed to find such clarity and narrative structure while writing about physical places. I fear getting lost in excessive detail and not allowing the story to unfold.
I have to unmute myself. Great question. And so I do consider myself a place-based writer. And I feel like there's so many opportunities when writing about place, right? Because places have so many layers, right? The history, the culture. You can talk about how people in that place negotiate visibility or negotiate belonging. So I just feel like it's a very rich thing to write about. And in my work, at least I try to bring the places I'm writing about, for example, Eastern Circle, to life. To give them their own life, right? Because Eastern Circle has a history too. And my family and my neighbors are part of that, but I also want readers to understand that history. And so in terms of clarity and narrative around a place, so there's something called that I think of as the slow release of information, over the span of a book or over the span of an essay. And when I was first starting to write, I feel like I wanted to say everything right away. And that first paragraph and that first page. And now I have to think about, how do I build something slowly? So I might know the whole story. And I do at this point. I know Eastern Circle, at least from 1960 till about maybe 2020. And so I have to say, now, how do I make this a journey for the reader? And I think about my own journey that I actually took as the writer. And then I think about, well, what would that journey look like for the narrator, right? There's so many things I did not know about Eastern Circle living there, right? One of them was that there was a 4-year legal battle not to get the projects built. So the community that lived closest to Eastern Circle was a white community, waged a legal battle, and they went back and forth with the city for 4 years. I had no idea that happened, right? I was sitting in a library one day. It was actually a library at the newspaper. And the researcher there was helping me find all kinds of material for my research. And then I said, oh, can you see if there's any material in Eastern Circle? And she's looking, but she's finding all these other housing projects and she's giving me their material, but there's nothing on Eastern Circle. And then that kind of was really odd to me until I figured out, I said, oh, Eastview Terrace. Eastview Terrace is actually the official name, the name that the housing authority gave to Eastern Circle, but we called it by the name attached to the street. So right there, I start to think about, what is the official and unofficial story of Eastern Circle, right? And so any place I write about, just like any person I write about, I'm going to look for complexity. I'm going to look for what is hidden, maybe what's been erased, maybe what's been put to the side, and think about how I can bring that story out into the open. And if I didn't answer your question exactly, because sometimes it's hard to hold on to the different parts, please ask it again.
Thank you. A related question, Kathy wants to know, how did you decide to write about your history and the histories of others? Did that begin with your grandfather, or was there something else?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kathy. So I do love history. I love reading history. I love writing about history. But actually, I think this all started when I was very, very young, this impulse to record. Right. There's this great quote by Nikki Giovanni where she talks about, I'm not going to get it right, but she talks a little bit like, do we want to leave it to history, fields like history, to tell our stories? Right. So you can think about, what does literature add to history? What does art add to history? The history story, right? And so, okay. So when I was young, very young, I asked for a typewriter for Christmas, and my parents got it for me. It was this huge, blue, heavy typewriter. So I'm aging myself a little bit. My mom has kept all my writing from that typewriter. And I just started recording things about my family. Here's all of our names. Here's all of our ages. Here's all of our addresses. So in a sense, I feel like I was always interested in somewhat of record keeping. But as I got older, I started to see how the record, at least as I was getting it through high school and through college, was so distorted. Right. And so I had to think about, how do I want to counter those stories? Stories about poor Black families, which I think are distorted, even stories about the drug trade and the violence that accompanies it and the way communities resist. The stories I was reading was so different than what I experienced. You know, one of my majors as an undergraduate was a sociology major. So I read a lot of sociology, and I read many books about poor Black neighborhoods written by people who were outside of that neighborhood, outside of those neighborhoods that might be considered outsiders. And here I was, someone who had grew up in some of these neighborhoods that felt very much like Eastern Circle, but things were missing, it seemed like to me, or things weren't given enough complexity, the relationships we had. I feel like things were in many ways too simplistic. You know, I think about the structure of families. And when I was in sociology, it was all about the women are the head of the families and the women run the families. Well, in my experience, we needed everyone in a family, everyone, right? So, yeah. So history is important. And I feel like as artists, what we look at and what we decide to write about is important, because that becomes part of the record. That becomes something someone can go back to as part of the story of this country or this time period. And as we tell our individual stories, there's often a broader story connected to it. It's usually something within that story. There's this idea that like every life is an epic story, right? And so when I think about my grandparents moving to the North in 1952, I can think about this big story of the Great Migration. But I'm just going to tell it through their experience, right? I'm going to let that history unfold through these two people. I'm going to invoke that time period and what was causing people to leave and what people were running to. I'm going to evoke that through their experiences, right? And so at the same time I'm writing about history, I'm writing also a very private and personal story.
I love every life is an epic story. Do you feel New Haven is a microcosm of America?
I don't know if I would go that far, because I'm I don't know if I could speak to America in that way. But I think there's certain things that I find in my research that definitely make it a story about a city that relied on industry. You know, you think of Detroit and these other cities, right? So industry was huge in New Haven, right? They had a lot of industry. They had some of the biggest factories in the world. They had one of the biggest gun manufacturers in the world. They had this railroad that was connecting Boston and New York. And so it was supposed to be this kind of hub of financial center. They had lots of waterways. And so it was an easy place for to do trade. And so in that sense, when we think about industrialization and we think about the failure of industrialization, at least starting in the 1970s and continuing to today, and how that really not only closed certain factories, but closed their suppliers and all of this. And I think that can be stretched out through New Haven. I think the fact that New Haven didn't incorporate, which means it didn't collect taxes from the surrounding suburbs, right? And so as factories left and as more people with financial means left New Haven, and the tax base decreased, it just became a poorer and poorer and poorer city. And I think that's something that can be seen across America. The joblessness, absolutely. And we see how the drug trade impacted these major cities, right, throughout the country, right? So some of them were huge cities, some of them were mid-sized cities like New Haven, some of them were small cities. But I think that's a story that carries over from place to place. So I think I always write about New Haven, and I think it can be used as a lens to look at what happened in other cities that kind of had similar demographics or similar problems. But I think, yeah, so I think that's it. I don't know if I would say that, but I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at New Haven. But I will say, I think that could be true for almost every place, right? So you writing about your city, you writing about your neighborhood. I'm sure there are things that people can take and apply to where they live, right? And so if you know that that's what you want to do, sometimes we can talk ourselves out of it. Well, who cares about my family? Who cares about my neighborhood? Who cares about my city? Well, one, you do, and you can get your writers to care about it too. That's what we do as writers.
Thank you. Elena also wants to know, she says many of your stories and essays take place around New Haven. Have you written or do you plan to write about life in any other places? For example, your grandparents' lives before they moved up north. What is the significance of this place and setting aside from it being where you grew up?
Well, I think a lot of writers choose a place to write about, and it doesn't mean they don't write about other places. Sometimes it's a country, sometimes it's a city. So New Haven is where I have situated myself. There's lots of stories I want to tell about the city. And I think there's a lot about the city, as I said, that can be applied to other cities that are similar to it. But no, I think I will write about other places because there's certain topics I want to take up and look at how they have operated throughout the country, right? So I'm interested in mass incarceration and how it affects families, right? Not just the person who was put in prison, but how it affects the whole family. I'm interested in writing more about the crack epidemic. I think that, as I said, there's certain stories that are told in particular ways. And as a writer, I have to think, how do I want to counter those stories? And so with the drug story, I often find that the circle of complicity is really small, right? It's like the people selling on the street and the people taking the drugs. And yet it is this multi-billion-dollar global industry. Guns are trafficked. Gun traffic extends to all over this country and world. And there's a lot that has to happen for drugs to get to Eastern Circle, right? And so it starts outside of the United States with farmers, and then people in labs, chemists, and then distributors. And so in that sense, even though I'm writing about New Haven, you're getting those stories too, right? Because the drugs didn't just happen to be in New Haven and the guns didn't just happen to be in New Haven. That's something that involves the whole country. That's something that involves North America and South America. It's something that involves the hundreds of countries that are involved in the illegal drug trade.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an important point to be aware of not just what's happening to our families, but why and what are these greater systems, what role are they playing? I have a question about community policing. And the question is, if community policing is not the answer to ease tensions between police and communities of color, what would you like to see done instead, be it on a policy level or a grander human one? And I know that's a really big question.
That's okay. I will. So yes, I do have an essay called The Other America, which is about community policing in New Haven and all the ways that it has failed people. And, community policing they were doing it in the 1960s and 1970s, and you would be shocked to see the list of what they were doing. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what they're trying now. So I'm not against, involving community members in the protection of their own. But I tend to think, given the history of the police, right, from the night watchmen to the slave patrollers, all the way to the police departments, that the changes that often happen with community policing are incredibly superficial. They're superficial. And one of the things that I think is needed is an open, accessible, independent accountability system for police officers. Almost every profession has that. And often police are investigating their own colleagues. And so I think that's one of the things that really needs to happen. And, I look to organizations that are out there doing this work. American Civil Liberties Union, Black Lives Matter, Campaign Zero. I mean, they all have platforms around changes that they think should be made in America around policing. And we know that there's been, in the last year and a half, so many great people talking about this, people who have studied it and have written about it. And what really interests me is to change the way we think about community safety, change the way we think about who might provide assistance during different times, right? How mental health workers and social workers and other types of people might be able to get involved, in times of trouble instead of just going to the police. And I'm interested in those ideas, and I'm interested in thinking about how they can make people feel safe.
It's another really great question. Again, how do we make people feel safe? Jennifer wants to know, what is the biggest challenge you face being a writer and a woman of color, specifically in relation to publishing?
Okay, so thank you, Jennifer, for that question. I entered this kind of world of writing later than some. I was 38 years old when I decided to go back to school and get my MFA. And so that led me to be in kind of this different world that I was in, being in school, but also going to writing conferences. I started to go to writing residencies. And it was a world with very few people of color. And I had to really seek out the places that I thought I could be in community with people of color that were writers, that I could get to know them. And so it has been, I just made it a mission of mine, not only to be in community, but to amplify other voices. And in publishing, it's like everything else. I think there's so many roadblocks, right? And whether people consciously or unconsciously look for stories that they feel comfortable with or that they relate to, or, there's a certain type of, I guess, writing in the nonfiction world that I'm not drawn to, that feels more experimental, and it's not necessarily about telling a story. And I can respect people doing that, but it's not what I'm doing. And so, I have to think about all of those things. And what I've spent a lot of time doing in terms of getting my work published is actually reading lots and lots and lots of literary journals online and in print, so that I could find places that felt right for me and right for my work. Places where I would be thrilled, right? Because I'm seeing who they're publishing, I'm seeing what kind of work they're publishing. And there are places that have a good reputation that I've read and been just really turned off for some reason, and was like, I'll never submit my work to that. I'll never submit my work there, right? And so for me, it's been about finding places that feel like they can be home for my work. And it's such a mysterious it can be seen like such a mysterious process, because I don't know what happens behind closed doors, right? When people are looking at submissions and deciding what to publish. But I think I've tried to be really thoughtful about the places that I send my work, that I think will be open to it, in that it will be a good fit.
Thank you for that. I think we'll have time for maybe 2 more questions. What is your writing process like?
Hey, here we go. Love this question. And it's so funny because certain people have such different places they're thinking of with this question. So if I really don't hit what you're asking, let me know. I try to write as much as I can, but there are definitely days I don't get to write because I'm teaching all day, or involved in school things. I love to write in the morning because I'm just fresher and more awake, but I will write anytime, I will write anywhere that I have to. And I really see my writing as a practice. So it's not always about, I have to get this done by this day and this week, but can I keep writing, right? It's the same thing as I used to be a runner. You have to kind of work those muscles. Not every time you go out, you're going to feel strong and like you've done something great, but it's the practice that matters. And so I just try to sit and write. But I also know my writing doesn't just happen in front of the computer. And I said that earlier, right? Living and being out in the world, ideas and memories and feelings and all kinds of things come to me. So I'm not someone that, like, no matter what, I have to sit down in front of my computer every day. And I tend to want to write long. So I write. I can just sit and type and write, and it can be an absolute mess. But then I can go back and start shaping things. So even for, let's say, a 6 or 7 page essay, I might have another document that's 30 pages that I've cut from that essay. And sometimes it's information that I want. Sometimes it's something that I've written over and over again. But I try to spend a lot of time shaping a document. I try to spend a lot of time thinking about, what are my intentions? What is this essay really about, right? It's always something on the surface, but I tend to discover what the essay is actually about when I'm writing it. I start out thinking it's about one thing and I end up and it's about something else. And then I have to decide, do I follow that impulse? And then I convince myself that I should, even though I've done all this other work. I've had essays that have changed completely. So once I started to write an essay about the demolition of Eastern Circle, and I talked to experts and I watched videos of demolitions, and I talked to someone at the housing authority, and I was just like, I'm writing this essay about the demolition of Eastern Circle. And then the essay kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller as I revised it. And it was like a paragraph. And I was like, I don't think this is an essay. And so I ended up writing an essay about my mother and grandfather's garden. They each had a garden. And I think some of you have read that essay. But I could see how this idea of demolition shaped that essay, because ultimately, it's about the building of this garden, our roots in Eastern Circle, and about that being destroyed, right? And so I never feel like what you start out with has to be what you end up with.
Might be a perfect segue into the final question. And this person wants to know, what role does intention play in storytelling, whether you're writing about your own history or another's?
You said intention.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it's huge. I don't want to write a revenge story. I don't want to write something to get back at someone. I don't even want to write something to hurt someone. I feel like being a writer is, I have a responsibility almost to really think about my intentions before I write something. And often what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about the choices people make, and I'm trying to think about whether I think those choices are good or bad, the choices people make and what motivated them to make those choices. The writer Philip Lopate says, writing is thick imagining. So even with my stories, myself, when I'm writing about something I did, I have to really think about, well, why did I do that? What was that about? And definitely with other people, right? I think that's part of the job as a writer, is to try to understand things, understand people, understand the choices people make. And it doesn't mean forgiving, it doesn't mean accepting. But I think we can try to understand those things and write about them.
Thank you so much, Catina. It's been such a pleasure having you, and thank you for joining us from New York. I know it's later there, but it's just been such an honor to hear from you.
Thank you, everyone.
And I want to remind everyone else, our next event hosted by WSU's Visiting Writers Series is 1 week from today, Tuesday, March 23rd. We will be welcoming poet and memoirist C.S. Giscombe at 7 p.m. So don't miss it. And thank you all for joining us. And I hope you have a good rest of your night.